When it comes to crafting a presentation, how do you know what to leave out? That's just one of the topics we'll be discussing in today's Talking Talks. Hello and welcome to Talking Talks, a behind the scenes look at how great presenters make great presentations. I'm your host, Bri Williams, and today I am joined by Dave McCaughan. Dave runs a brand storytelling business called Bibliosexual. Dave is also a host of the podcast MR Realities and worked for marketing agency juggernaut McCann for over 25 years. I'm excited to talk to Dave today because he has spoken at over 600 conferences across all parts of the globe and has come up with some of the most interesting presentation topics I have ever seen. This will be a fascinating ride, so let's get started. Dave, welcome, and I would love us to start with this insight that I spotted on your website, and it is this thought, that I thought that we are often more convinced by the medium, the channel, the format than the actual content has always remained with me. So, Dave, what is that thought? What's that insight? How has it shaped your career and how has it shaped your approach to presentations?
The story goes back a long, long time ago. When I was in my 20s, I spent 10 years as a public librarian. And the advantage of being a public librarian in small suburban libraries in Sydney is you have a lot of time to kill, so you end up reading a lot of books. One day I was reading a novel and one of the characters was described as a bibliosexual. So I had to look that up, and it turned out that a bibliosexual is somebody who is physically, sexually turned on by the smell and touch of books. Would be a dangerous thing if you were a librarian, right? But what struck me about thinking about the word was that I started to think about, well, actually, all of us are sort of bibliosexuals because we're sort of turned on by different mediums, not by the necessarily the content, but by the medium itself. And I guess the first example that came to me, because I've always been a bit of a student of history and I studied the Reformation at university. And of course, if you remember, one of the keystones that got the Reformation going was that if you went back to the 1400s across Europe, in every small village there was a church. And in the church, there was the only book in the village would be the Bible. And there would be a priest. Now, quite often it turned out that the priest was illiterate as well. So nobody was reading the Bible, but whatever the priest or the church said was in the Bible, that was the rule, right? And throughout most of mankind's history, most people were illiterate, but were told if it's in a book, it's correct. Now, go back, Bri, to when you were at university, and I'm sure you were a brilliant student, but if you handed in an essay, it didn't matter how good it was. If you didn't have a bibliography, you failed, right? And why was that? That was the legacy of this cultural belief that it must be in a book to be true. Now, that's a case of bibliosexuality, where we believe in the medium more than necessarily the content. The other example I always like to give is, if I write, or if you write, and you write great articles, etc., but if you wrote an article and it was placed in the Daily Telegraph and in The Economist, most people would see it in the Daily Telegraph and go, must be rubbish. The exact same article in The Economist, oh, I must take note of that, it must be worth something, because the medium is the thing that we're attracted to, etc. Keeping that in mind and thinking about what that means, it means understanding what really matters to people. And so we're seeing this with COVID right at the moment, right? For an awful lot of people, it's not about whether the science is true or not, because the science is beyond most of us to understand. It's basically who's delivering the message. What has that meant for being a speaker or presenting at conferences and things like that? Well, one of the things it's taught me was that, what's the medium you're using. Now, the mediums you use are, of course, your voice, And if you're at a conference, it's, you know, the stagecraft, it's the tools you use, it's whether you use PowerPoint or not use PowerPoint. You know, I was really interested years ago when I was very young, and I heard Professor Manning Clark give a lecture, and it was actually at a business event. I was amazed that he kept an audience of business people quiet, wrapped in what he was saying. He spoke for 30 minutes, no notes, no background. He just talked for 30 minutes about fairly obscure historical subjects about Australia. And it was just the way he delivered it, right? So understanding which mediums work, what's going to attract people and how to use the tools, that's all part of what I call bibliosexuality, right? Understanding what it is that people are going to believe in or be attracted to, whether it's rational or not, you know.
I love that, and I think that's why I'm so drawn to your work, Dave. It's sort of the intersection of my field and yours, in that I'm always looking at, it's not necessarily what you say, it's how you say it. And influencing skills is all around that. Now, one of the things, I've got some clips here of some ways that you've gone about introducing yourself, because I think one of those ways of establishing credibility on stage is how you introduce yourself. So we're going to watch some clips, and then I'd really like for you to walk us through the different approaches you tend to use in your prezos.
It's great to be at the Wellness Summit. I am lucky enough over the last 20, 25 years to speak at an average of about 30 conferences a year all around the world, and conferences on all sorts of weird subjects. In fact, so I wanted to spend some time taking you through some of the things I've been learning as I've been working with some clients. I've seemed to have been sat endlessly in webinars the last 2-3 months. I think actually this is the 7th webinar I've done in the last 5 days, where I've been a participant in either the research industry, the wellness industry, etc., different aspects of learning about what people are doing, and trying to put some of that together, hopefully to help some of you as you think through the future. Right. This is the view from my window. Like most of the world for the last year, I spent a lot of time just looking outside, trying to understand what's going on. I'm Dave McCaughan. G'day. I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia today. This is the window from the back of the apartment that I'm living in at the moment. The view is great, but views are also about the way in which we see the world. And this year we've learnt to see the world slightly differently. So I want to talk to you about that today.
Yeah, so a couple of different approaches, and I don't think it's to do with being stage versus virtual, but talk us through your different approaches and why you introduce yourself differently for different presentations.
I think it's really important depending on the audience and the subject. So quite often in recent years, when I'm asked to go on big stages, and that first clip, it was an audience of about 1,000 people at a global conference being held in Singapore. It was the afternoon of the 3rd day. But what I think is really important is to think about the context of the conference or the event, who else is speaking, what my delivery is supposed to be about in that context. And then also, you know, the times and conditions outside. I mean, the last clip you showed, I was talking about coping and some work I'd done in understanding coping in COVID times. Well, of course, that's going to have a different tonality than when I start talking about men's underpants, as maybe we'll talk about, right? Which is a subject I've talked about at conferences all over the world. And the reason people bring me back to talk about that is because it's sort of funny. Right? If there's a serious message in terms of business inside the talk I give, but, you know, stropping around in my underpants on stage and getting other men to strip down to their underpants on stage, hey, that's light relief. The other thing, of course, is that sometimes it's important to set up what your credibility is, right? You know, most of the time I'm standing in front of people that don't know really who I am. It's different when it's, for example, when I used to work for one of the global ad agencies and I was their representative head of strategy for Asia, I would go to industry events, and there'd be a chunk of people that know, oh yeah, there's that weird guy from McCann. They know who I was. A lot of the conferences I'm doing, I'm just a name that's on the agenda, right? And a photo and stuff. And so sometimes it's important to stand up and just, it's the 30-second credentials. Hey, like I've talked at a lot of conferences, and it's really interesting to be able to talk at a conference like this in comparison to others. And there's a difference too. If you're the sole speaker at an event, if you're an after dinner speaker or the guest speaker at somebody's internal conference, it's different from when you're at a conference and you're one of 5, 10, 15 or 50 speakers, where you want to start off in a way that people go, oh yeah, I remember that guy, right? And let's face it, it doesn't matter whether they've given you 10 minutes or an hour. They're going to remember 2 lines probably, right, out of what you talk about, right? They're going to remember something from the first few minutes, and then if you're lucky, they're going to remember what your main point was that you were trying to get across, no matter how many illustrations you were trying to give.
And when it comes to that main point, in your process, at what point do you come up with that? Do you come up with that and then you go, that's going to be my end point on this presentation, or I'm going to have it in the middle of the presentation? So how do you firstly conceptualize what your main point is going to be for whatever talk you're going to give? And then where do you place it and how do you position it within the presentation?
Oh, it's the old adage, right? Say it, illustrate it, say it again. So you've got to allude to it fairly early on. Thanks very much. I'm going to I'm going to talk to you today a bit about X. Now, it doesn't matter what the title of the presentation or the snazzy little graphics I've got going on. You've got to, right at the beginning, sort of get across in that first minute or two, this is actually about X, right? And then the whole purpose of it doesn't matter. Again, you can have 2 minutes or you can have 50 minutes. The rest of it is illustration of what that is, right? And drop the key phrase back in a couple of times, and then make sure that at the end it's pretty clear. Look, I know I took you on a tangent to get there. I know I've shown you different examples that you may not relate, but actually, if you think about it, what I've been talking to you about is X. And X, again, is important because to you, as this audience, because of whatever, right?
So a key phrase, is that something that you wordsmith? So you make sure that you've got the key phrase and you might have a couple of nuances of how you describe it, but that's what you're repeating.
Yeah, it could be a key phrase or it could be something that's key to the audience. For example, when I talk a lot about aging Asia and rethinking aging Asia. So I use the phrase New Life Builders, which is a phrase I've been using for about 25 plus years to refer to the new way to think about people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? The reason I use that as a title for the talk, I'll use that phrase a number of times throughout it, right? And so I'm trying to reinforce that I'll have different illustrations of what that means depending on the audience, but it's getting across like, when you think of somebody that says 60 or 70 or 80, stop thinking they're about to die. Start thinking about they're actually thinking, what am I going to do for the next 20 or 30 years, right? How am I going to fill in the time? What's going to happen to me? And so you start using phrases like that. Of course, you also sometimes you have to think about using some sort of catchy thing to grab people's attention, so my mum's throne room.
Well,
right?
and speaking of which, let's have a look at some of these brilliant titles that you have put out into the world. So how do you go about crafting a title that stands out on the program, but also is one of those talks that people remember?
Well, sometimes obviously it's self-interest. The top one, Bibliosexuality, is because that's what I've sort of called my own consultancy over the last 7 years as that's got going. But it's also been a background to what I was doing even when I was in corporate world, right? Sometimes it's got to do with, I was asked to speak at a conference about market research, which is sort of the industry I've played in the most over the last 30 years. and market research for advertising, but I was asked to talk about market research and something to do with innovation. So then I decided, well, maybe what I'll talk about is the way in which categories, categories of brands and products innovate. And so I need to have a good example. I need to have a good example. I need to have a good example. And like most people, I do my best thinking sitting on the toilet. And so it came to me one day that innovation, yes, things that really make a difference. And remember, my underlying theme for everything I do is what really matters to people. And I was reminded of a story that is true. So I was actually raised in Mount Druitt in Western Sydney in the days when Mount Druitt was basically farms. My mother was from London. My father was from Belfast. I was conceived on the boat out from the UK. Born and raised in the far western suburbs of Sydney in a house that had no indoor toilet. And when I was 8, we moved to North Rocks, just outside Parramatta, a more middle-class sort of suburb. And the first day we were there, I was 8 years old, my brother was 5, and we were upset because we knew we'd never see our friends again, right? At 25 kilometres in those days, we'd never had a telephone in the house before, right? So this was like, we were never going to see our friends. My mother, who had been a sergeant in the British Army during World War II and was a very tough woman, it was the first time we ever saw her cry. And we thought she was crying because she was upset at having to move and she was going to miss her friends. No, she was crying because in her whole life, she'd never lived in a house with an indoor toilet before. And she basically was crying, and she actually, when we brought that up later over the years, she said, well, that was the point when I was sure that my sons would grow up to be middle class because they lived in a house with an indoor toilet. So when I was thinking about, how do I talk about innovation and how categories innovate, suddenly it hit me, there you go. That's a good one. Now, the other thing that tied into then was social media, because, of course, the oldest social medium in the world is the toilet. And when I talk about my mum's throne room, and the name of the speech is My Mum's Throne Room, because that first toilet in that house that we shared was referred to in our family as the throne room. And then when I talk about that, I talk about how people have treated toilets as throne rooms, or treated toilets as social mediums, as the center of the home, as the center of society. Romans built their cities around public toilets, right? And so it becomes a string of things that go out like that. But it comes back to me being able to reinforce this point about, do you really understand the way things develop?
And this very strong storytelling DNA that you have throughout your consultancy, but also just as part and parcel of the way you communicate. Now, one of the things I've been dying to know with you, Dave, because you've got this amazingly rich background in industry, you work in market research, you're on the pulse of so many different factors. So you're not short of ideas and insights. How on earth do you know what to leave out of your presentations? Because the ones I had a look at, thank you for sharing, and I'll have those in the show notes, no presentation seemed the same because you were curating it for the audience. So how do you go about that process of knowing what to leave out?
Again, you have to think about the audience. Look, if you think about it, I learned storytelling primarily, again, by being a children's librarian. And I run storytelling workshops, etc. And sometimes I still do the trick of saying, okay, we're going to start off by, you're all going to take turns. Here's a Dr. Seuss book. Now, we're going to sit on the ground and you're going to tell us that story. And the thing I learned, as I always point out, there is no tougher audience than a group of 5-year-olds. All right. And so what you have to do is to figure out how you're going to tell the story. What's the tonality? What voices are you going to use? Are you going to focus on the pictures, or are you going to get them to focus on you? And different groups of kids will be different depending on the circumstances. It's the same with big audiences. Look, it's very different from, if I've been asked to give an after-dinner talk to 10 people sitting around in a luxury restaurant in a private room, that's very different from standing in front of 1,000 anonymous faces, right? that maybe are all Japanese, and and they're just going, what's this guy doing? Well, you have to think about that, obviously about the audience, the circumstance. The other thing that I've noticed too is, and I'm always surprised, as I said, I tend, when I go to conferences, to sit through the conference and to watch whoever's speaking. And quite often I'll get invited to conferences, and I like to joke I'm the light relief speaker amongst a bunch of scientists. I don't understand 90% of what they're talking about, but I try, because when I'm up on stage or I'm in front of the audience, I think it's always good to be able to refer back to what somebody else said, but more importantly, to understand what the tonality of the audience is. Some audiences, you just get that feeling, you can understand, or forget the joke, let's do this a bit more seriously. Let's less illustrations, more rational facts, if you like, those sorts of things. But to your point about, what do I discard? It's hard, because I always have way too much. I'm probably like most people. If you rang me up tomorrow and said, "Hey, I want you to come and talk at this conference. We're going to give you 30 minutes." The first thing that will happen is that I'll start collecting stuff, and I'll have 2 hours worth of stuff, right? And then I've just got to start weeding it out. And then what you have to do, though, is you have to go back to what we talked about before. Is like, what's that one thing you want people to remember? And so one of the things is to get rid of the stuff that's going to distract from that. You might have really other interesting facts. You might have really interesting statistics, or you might have really interesting, historical stories or whatever it is, or illustrations. But you just got to, no, I'm not going to use that today. I'll use that for a different thing another time, right? Because, and I'll give you the example. I joked about the toilet speech.
As Steve points out, I end up talking about toilets and underwear an awful lot, and I will continue to do that tonight.
I guess I've given that speech 30 times in maybe 20 countries around the world. Literally today, 3 different people messaged me with bits of toilet trivia they'd seen on the internet somewhere. Literally, there's not a day gone by in the last 5 years that somebody doesn't send me something about toilets. Now, 90% of it I've probably seen before. But, today somebody sent me a cartoon that I'd never seen before. I had a giggle, and I thought, I'll put that in the folder. I'll end up using that, et cetera, et cetera. And so the subject as well. I mean, I talk about a lot of things, but remember, my main theme is always to come back to what really matters to people. Okay. And so it doesn't matter. I'll use toilets or underwear or aging populations or lots of other things to illustrate that. But really, it's to get that audience to think about, well, what really matters to people, and are you thinking about what matters? And if you put that filter in, then you can sort of get rid of a lot of stuff.
And to dive a little bit deeper on your process, are you working with a battery of slides that you have in a library, and you're sort of sifting and sorting them, or do you start with a blank slate and storyboard something? What process do you use in order to curate your content?
It depends. Obviously, I do. As I said, people will come back to me and say, look, I saw you give this speech or give this talk at this thing. Can you do that or a version of that? I never do the same thing exactly the same. So, yes, under different headings on my battered old laptop, there is the toilet folder, there's the underwear folder, there's the Aging Asia folder, there's the XYZ folder. And in some of those, there'll be 500, 600 charts, PowerPoint charts. And there are some that I use a lot, and there's some that I might have only used once, right? But then, again, people will come to me and sort of say, hey, could you talk about this? And so I'll start from scratch, and the toilet thing was a good example. The organisation that asked me to do something, they didn't expect me to talk about toilets, right? They asked me to talk about innovation and research, and that led me to I've got to do something different. It was an audience that I talked to before, about the year before. I talked to them about underpants and the history of men's underwear, and everybody had cracked up, and it was like, that's why I got asked back. But now I have to think of something totally new, totally different, right? And every now and again that happens. So you start off from scratch. And I think most good speakers have one or two common themes that run through everything they talk about, right? And so you're just finding different ways of saying it in an interesting way.
An interesting way is the secret, isn't it? And Dave, we're at time, so I could talk to you for hours because you're a font of knowledge when it comes to speaking, the craft of speaking, and how to deliver engaging presentations. So thank you so much for spending your time and sharing your ideas with us. Now, you'll find more information about Dave at his website, bibliosexual.weebly.com, and you can probably even find information about underwear on there. But as always, you can find me at briwilliams.com. Don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future episodes of Talking Talks, and I look forward to sharing more with you very soon.
Recording
this time.
Okay. All righty. One sec. Just realised that this device was not plugged in. We're about to run out of power. Okay.